For applications of the categorical imperative. Kant's four applications of the categorical imperative are intended to showcase the principle's practical conclusions. We need to explain his examples in order to arrive at a correct understanding of how Kant interprets the principle as an expression of unconditional moral duty purified of all empirical elements, despite its ability to guide specific concrete decision-making in everyday moral situations. He begins by indicating that the categorical imperative supports the same sort of ethical judgments and justifies the same types of moral actions that are often accepted as implications of conventional morality. These are divided in a way that is also standard in other moral systems between duties we owe personally to ourselves and those we owe to others, and also in terms of perfect and imperfect duties. It will be worthwhile to say something about the two overlapping categories of duties, which are not always observed in contemporary moral philosophy. The distinction between duties owed to oneself by contrast with others is clear enough from its terminology and marks an obvious division in Kant's four examples. The first and third examples in Kant's analysis, not to commit suicide and to develop one's talents, are duties to oneself, whereas the second and the fourth examples, repayment of debts and charitable donation of surplus wealth, concerns duties to others. The distinction between perfect and imperfect moral duties is less common in modern ethics, but involves the difference between what is morally obligatory to do by contrast with what it is morally permissible to do. The idea is that a perfect moral duty is one that describes something definite that we are morally required to fulfill, whereas an imperfect moral duty does not command but permits action, and hence is less definite and positive in its command, prescribing only what is morally allowed or unforbidden. By this account, Kant's first and second examples involves moral permissibility, are imperfect, and his third and fourth examples involving moral obligations are perfect. Kant initiates this part of his discussion by stating his purpose in offering illustrations of how the categorical imperatives can be applied in these lines, in this sentence in the yellow highlight. We shall now enumerate a few duties in accordance with the usual division of them into duties to ourselves and to other beings, and into perfect and imperfect duties. Kant's four applications of the categorical imperative include the question of whether it is morally permissible to commit suicide in dire circumstances, whether it is morally permissible to accept a loan of money, falsely promising to repay it, and knowing in advance that one will not be able to repay, whether it is morally obligatory to develop one's natural talents as opposed to living an unproductive life of lazy pleasure, and whether it is morally obligatory to donate surplus wealth to others in need as an act of charity. The first example in Kant's account is explained in these terms. Kant presupposes throughout that the persons who are contemplating the morality of a certain action are faced with specific circumstances that require a moral action, and that they accept the categorical imperative as the principle by which to arrive at a morally correct decision. The categorical imperative is supposed to determine what the agents are morally obligated or permitted to do, whether to themselves or to others, as a perfect or imperfect moral duty. Kant, elsewhere, refers to the bridge principles required for such real-time applications of the abstract principles of the categorical imperative as typics. Typics. Here, in his first application, Kant invites us to consider the question that many persons confront during especially difficult periods in their lives. In the case study of a potential suicide. Let's read the one in blue, and of course, it will continue as this is not enough. Someone feels sick of life because of a series of troubles that has grown to the point of despair, but is still so far in possession of his reason that he can ask himself whether it would not be contrary to his duty for himself to take his own life. Now he inquires whether the maxim of his action could indeed become a universal law of nature. His maxim, however, is, from self-love, I make it my principle to shorten my life when its longer duration threatens more troubles than it promises agreeableness. The only further question is whether this principle of self-love could become a universal law of nature. It is then seen at once that a nature whose law it would be to destroy life itself by means of the same feeling, whose destination is to impel towards the furtherance of life, would contradict itself and would therefore not subsist as nature. Thus, that maxim could not possibly be a law of nature, and accordingly, altogether opposes the supreme principle of all duty. Kant's method in applying the categorical imperative is easily identified in this first example, as is the sense in which his deontological ethics is rational, formalistic, unconditional, and free of any empirical impurities. The procedure is to first identify the maxim or ethical rule of guidance that a moral agent is considering as justifying a contemplated action. In this case, the act under review is committing suicide, and the relevant moral maxim, at least as Kant characterizes it in this instance, is to shorten one's life when its continued duration threatens more evil than it promises satisfaction. The second step is to determine whether or not the moral maxim in question can be willed to be a universal moral law for all rational beings. This is equivalent to the question whether the agent can will the maxim to be a universal law of nature. What makes these two formulations on the second step of Kant's method of applying the categorical imperative equivalent is that if a maxim can be willed to be universal for all rational subjects, then it is an unconditional law, like a law of physics, but one that holds despite the terminology of Kant's earlier distinction between laws of nature and laws of freedom for all rational beings as moral agents, regardless of their species or psychology. By analogy, a law of physics, such as the universal law of gravity in Newton's mechanics, is indifferent to the specific substances to which it applies, holding alike with respect to iron, to wood, water, and fire, to apples falling off apple trees, and so on. A universalizable moral maxim is one that a moral agent can will to be a natural law in the sense of providing moral guidance as a law of freedom for all rational beings and all moral agents. If a moral maxim is universalizable in the sense as the general form of the categorical imperative prescribes, Then the agent, who is considering adopting a course of action falling under a moral maxim, is supposed to be able to will that the maxim be adopted as a universal principle of action for all individuals capable of reasoning. The question that remains, of course, is, but which holds the clue to understanding Kant's categorical imperative is precisely that point. What it means to ask whether the moral maxim at issue is an application of the categorical imperative can be willed to be a law of nature or universal principle of moral judgment. How do we decide if we are any of the moral agents trying to make use of the categorical imperative in any of Kant's applications, whether we can or cannot will that the relevant moral maxim be a universal law for all rational decision makers? The answer is not fully elaborated in Kant's exposition, but is clear enough from what he says. The idea is that a maxim is universalizable in the sense of being such that it can be willed to be a universal law of nature, or better, a universal law of freedom, just in case there is no contradiction or logical inconsistency in willing that the maxim be adopted by all rational beings. Kant says that if the maxim that is supposed to justify a decision to making suicide were universally accepted, then you see almost immediately an outright contradiction would result. To repeat the essential passage, Kant would say, almost immediately, he'd say there, it is then at once realized that a law of nature, blah, blah, blah. There, one sees the contradiction because a law of nature whose law it would be to destroy life itself by means of the same feeling whose destination is to impel towards the furtherance of life would contradict itself. How will it be the same principle? If a contradiction obtains, then of course the moral agent cannot will the maxim to be a universal law to be adopted by all rational beings. Logical inconsistency in that case effectively and in the strongest imaginable way prevents the agent from willing that the maxim of self-love, implying the permissibility of committing suicide when life threatens more dissatisfaction than satisfaction, be universally accepted. There can be no more powerful inhibition to willing that such a maxim be universally adopted than encountering an outright logical contradiction when making the attempt. Since logical inconsistency is a purely formal matter, it's also clear why and in what sense Kant's moral philosophy is formalistic. Kant's ethics, resting on the categorical imperative and the formal universalizability of moral maxims, is a purely rational moral philosophy from which empirical elements are eliminated. It all comes down to logic, a formal question of contradiction or non-contradiction, in the attempt to will that a moral maxim be universally accepted by all rational agents. We must nevertheless ask whether Kant is right to claim that a contradiction results in the case he describes when an agent tries to universalize the moral maxim. We must also ask whether Kant identifies the moral maxim as the principle that would justify a decision to commit suicide under the circumstances he prescribes. We might observe, as other critics of Kant's principle have also commented, that the maxim he makes as a basis for a judgment of universalizability is rather weak. There are few persons contemplating a decision as drastic as whether or not to commit suicide that would be guided by the principle that suicide is justified merely when the continuance of life threatens more dissatisfaction than satisfaction. The usual scenario in which suicide is considered is one in which a person faces excruciating pain or humiliation with no possibility of relief. A standard case is that in which an agent is suffering from an incurable disease that will slowly bring about a prolonged death anyway, and in the meantime cause unbearable suffering. It is usually the avoidance of that extreme type of misery that, rather than mere avoidance of dissatisfaction with life, that outweighs by however small an amount the satisfaction to be enjoyed if one continues to live. It seems correct to conclude, despite these objections, that if Kant's purpose is merely to provide examples to indicate how the categorical imperative is supposed to work, then there's nothing wrong with his deliberately choosing an overly simplified case. The suicide example involves an unrealistic moral maxim that is easily seen to be universalizable or ununiversalizable by virtue of engendering a formal logical contradiction that prevents the agent from willing that all rational agents accept and act on the same principle. We might therefore agree with Kant that if a moral agent contemplates suicide as an act to be justified by the moral maxim to end life, whenever its continuation threatens more dissatisfaction than satisfaction, then the action would not be morally justified by the categorical imperative and probably should not be. So if anyone were to reason in this way, along these lines, and on the basis of such flimsy moral maxim, without asserting that this is the only or even the primary maxim that a potential suicide might invoke in order to try to satisfy such a decision, and if a moral maxim reflecting Kant's principle, this principle of self-love, cannot be willed to be universally accepted because it is internally, logically self-contradictory, promoting and at the same time eliminating the possibility for the furtherance of life, then the action is undoubtedly morally unjustified, as the categorical imperative rightly implies. As we shall see, the other examples in Kant's for categorical imperatives, for applications of the categorical imperative, involve even more inventive discoveries and contradictions. The search for inconsistencies that block an agent from willing a moral maxim to be universally accepted by all rational beings sometimes requires Kant to cast about for background assumptions. Such assumptions involve purposes that might be, but are not always obviously analytically contained in the concept of rational moral agent. It is only in connection with these assumptions that a given moral maxim runs into some kind of apparent conflict that Kant then characterizes as a contradiction to willing the universal acceptance of a moral maxim for a prohibited action. The remaining three examples in Kant's repertoire are also problematic, although the next case is often admitted to be the most intuitive. What this next case is, you'd see in the next recording. If you like these discussion on Kant's four applications of the categorical imperative, this is the first. Please also do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this page. This is Samo't sa Simula. Thank you very much.